Okay, why don't we get started? It's right now 11 o'clock here in Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. And so good morning to those of you here and good afternoon to those of you in Europe and probably good evening to those of you in Asia if you're tuning in. But welcome to the Institute for European Russian Invasion Studies. First of all, let me ask those of you who are not speaking to please put yourself on mute. That would be very um, helpful. So we're very lucky today. My name is Bob Ortung. I'm a research professor at the Institute. Obviously, I'm sorry we can't have you all in person and share pastries, sit around the table and talk. But this is the next best thing. And today we're very lucky to have Vlad Barash, who's going to be speaking about the digitally mediated public sphere in Russia, mapping VKontakte in 2020. And Vlad has earned his Ph.D. at Cornell in information sciences, and Graphika, of course, is the cartographers of the internet. So very much looking forward to the talk. If you have questions, you can either put them in the chat and I can ask them to Vlad, or he'll speak for about a half an hour and then we'll have plenty of time for questions on. So if you want to hold your question and ask it in person, I'll be happy to recognize you on Zoom and you can ask your question that way. So either way, if you want to put it in the chat, please do that, or save it and you can ask directly after the talk is over in about 30 minutes. So Vlad, let me turn the floor over to you. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for welcoming me to this event. I'm very excited to be able to tell you about this research. Can you see my screen?
Everyone yes, see that's my screen? Perfect. Perfect.
All right, great. All right, well, as Bob said, my name is Vlad Barash. I'm the chief scientist of Graphika. I am responsible for our overall research direction and strategic planning. And I'm here to talk to you about the digitally mediated public sphere in Russia. So this talk is labeled 2020, but it is actually the latest chapter in a long series of research that started in about 2010. So I'm going to start by talking about some of that previous research and then move on to the current work. So what have we learned so far? We started this project, like I said, a long time ago, partnering with the Berkman Center at Harvard. We've since had other partners, but the initial motivation for the project is that major social media platforms have had a strong presence in Russia. Today, it's about 22 million Facebook users, 4 million Twitter users, and about 100 million VK users, which we'll get to later in the talk, about 14 million active Telegram users. New platforms are constantly being explored by the Russian populace, such as YouTube, most famously with videos of Alexei Navalny. This slide says 28 million views for Don't Call Him Timon, Alexei's research into or exposure of corruption around former Prime Minister and President Dmitry Medvedev. But of course, the updated version of the slide should say more than 100 million views for Navalny's latest video, Putin's Palace, exposing this palace on the Black Sea that is allegedly owned by Putin or dedicated to Putin as part of this gigantic billion-dollar bribe. Social media is also an active battleground in Russia today, as that research or those videos just show. It is not just a place for casual discussion, though a lot of that happens as well, but political and social issues are constantly being debated on social media and sometimes lead to direct action. Speaking of which, so our original paper series with the Berkman Center was in response to this big catalyst event when the pro-government, the pro-Putin regime forces really started engaging with social media. Prior to 2010, the conventional wisdom goes that they were not particularly engaged with social media. They were very focused on controlling the message on mainstream media and mass media, but they didn't really see Twitter or Facebook as a threat, not even as a really significant part of the conversation. What happened in 2011 specifically was the regular Duma elections, the Russian parliament elections happened, but those were marred with reports of election irregularities, which led to serious protests, the most serious protests possibly for Putin ever until that point. And these protests were organized in part on social media. This really made the government wake up and take a look at Twitter and at other platforms and try to establish a presence there and control the message there. Finally, the government followed through on its plan, and it did not stop there. It was very ambitious. And in some ways, I have to say its ambition paid off. Having established a presence on social media, government-aligned accounts proceeded to use these platforms to spread disinformation, first at home and then abroad. This was detailed in a report we did with the Oxford Internet Institute in 2018 on behalf of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which asked us to look at Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election. One of the findings of that report was that that interference did not come out of nowhere. Quite to the contrary, it came out, it was a natural evolution of years of Russian efforts, first to control the message among its own populace, and then in the near abroad space during the conflict in Ukraine in 2014, 2015. So that was the context for the previous research. We also had some very interesting sociological and media-related findings from the previous research. We saw a high degree of political polarization, and especially in 2018 when looking at the Twitter landscape. I'll explain what landscape and the way we use landscape and map in just a little bit. The Russian Facebook landscape appears much less polarized than the Twitter landscape, though this finding has to come with a caveat because Facebook only makes a small part of its data available, specifically the public pages, and does not make private page discussion available. Russian state-sponsored media and disinfo outlets dominate the Twitter landscape and are heavily represented in the Facebook landscape. So this is not just a presence of activity. This is a presence with a strategic purpose and a strategic goal to dominate the message and to control the narrative. Content pushed by pro-Putin communities on Twitter benefits from a high degree of message focus on conflict in Ukraine and support from official government accounts. Content pushed by anti-Putin communities lacks such focus and support. This is part of the government's strategy to do narrative control, and it is a very organized and centralized strategy. As part of these findings, we observed that pro-Putin communities on Twitter have had a remarkably high turnover since 2012, much higher than anti-Putin communities, which suggests that there may have been an effort to rebuild these communities from the ground up in the wake of the 2011 protests. And finally, both anti and pro-Putin communities are targeting the next generation of Russians, especially on YouTube, VKontakte, and newer social media platforms. That brings me naturally to the topic of today's study. So we have looked at Twitter, we have looked at Facebook, we haven't looked at VKontakte yet. Meanwhile, VKontakte is the most popular social media platform in Russia with about 83% penetration. This means about 83% of active Russian internet users are on VKontakte. Russia itself has a very high internet penetration, generally north of 70%, which means that the platform really represents the Russian populace as a whole and not some biased sample of it. It provides a more geographically and culturally diverse picture of the mediated public sphere, digitally mediated public sphere in Russia than Twitter or Facebook. We found that political groups present on VKontakte in 2020, much like in previous landscapes, but there's a crucial difference where in this landscape, the pro-regime and anti-regime groups represent broad political coalitions instead of extremist cores or wings. There's also a very interesting local politics group that we found that I will describe in a moment. The communities we discovered have distinctly different patterns of media sharing. Kremlin outlets may act as cultural bridges between Putin supporters and cultural conservatives. This is a very important finding that speaks to the continuation and the breadth of that strategy of narrative control, because a cultural bridge is a node that plays a very important role in a network that connects otherwise disconnected nodes. And we see Kremlin outlets taking that role almost certainly intentionally. It is very unlikely that they would just naturally become cultural bridges between different communities. Finally, we find some evidence of a divergence in priorities for the major cultural and political constituencies in Russia in the summer of 2020. So I've given you the overall findings and highlights. I want to get a little bit deeper into the details now. So first and foremost, I want to talk about what we mean by analyzing a landscape, cyber-social landscape, or a map. Graphika's approach to this study and to research broadly is focused very much on networks, and it is focused on this notion of a cyber-social terrain, which is basically a set of people connected around a particular topic or geography or political or social stratum and mediated by technology. This notion is motivated by the fact that we think geography and offline connectivity is not as strong a glue today as online digital connectivity, and does not have the reach and breadth that online digital connectivity has. So generally speaking, for most of human history, the people you knew and the people you interacted with and the trade deals you formed, the information you exchanged, were based on where you lived geographically. And ever since mass telecommunications came onto the scene, there was this dramatic change where all of a sudden where you lived started mattering a little bit less than who you knew. You could instantaneously communicate with someone halfway across the world, form a trade deal. If you were a government, you could launch a war across thousands of miles in the blink of an eye, even as early as the invention of the telegraph 150 years ago. But of course, especially now in the global, digitally interconnected world. So much as in the pre-mass telecommunications times, it was critical to map where people live to understand how they behave, so do we believe it is critical today to map who people know and how they're connected by technology to understand how they behave. So that preamble, I want to make it a little bit more specific now. On this slide, we're looking at some actual maps that we built for different phases of this project. Each map represents a different collection of people connected by technology, a different cyber-social landscape. On the left, we have a Twitter map we did for 2018, and on the right, the Facebook map we did for 2018. But both maps have the same basic structural elements. They both appear as these sets of dots. We make them rotate on the screen just so you can see a little bit more of them, but they don't have to rotate. Each dot is an account. So on the left, each dot is a Twitter account. On the right, each dot is a Facebook page, public page. Each dot has a size, which represents its influence in the space. So for Twitter, a number of Twitter followers in the map, and a color, which represents the community that this dot belongs to. The community has been algorithmically defined, but also vetted by human subject matter experts to make sure these maps accurately represent the underlying sociological reality. Finally, each dot has a location. The location of these accounts in the space is not arbitrary, but it is important in a relative sense. What I mean by that is the closer two dots are together, the more socially embedded those accounts are, the more friends they have in common, the more followers they have in common, the more they interact. And that one basic principle creates these intricate shapes that can actually reveal something about the social, cultural, political structure of the underlying space. So to get even more specific, I want to look at some of these maps in detail. First, as way background, I am showing here the very first map we did as part of this project on Twitter in 2012, which was right after this Duma election and these protests. And the shape of this map is not particularly obvious, and that is significant in and of itself. The map looks kind of like a circle with no distinguishing characteristics or geometries. And that sociologically tells us that there is no single axis of organization or structure that dominates this space. And indeed, when we look at the specific communities that appear in Russia in 2012, we see a number of different poles or axes of interest, but nothing dominant. There is a public affairs community that is interested in politics, but it actually represents only about 5.5% of the map. There are large communities around tech and design, music. You will notice that there are communities around Ukraine and Belarus and Central Asia. As you can see, these maps are digitally mediated and do not stop at geographical boundaries, underscoring that same principle of it's important who you know and not what passport you have or where do you live geographically. So that was the picture in 2012. Contrast in 2018, very different picture. This is what we call a peanut map of political, that represents political polarization. The edges of the peanut represent the more extreme parts of the political spectrum, whereas the center of the map represents the more mainstream centrist core. Here on the right, we happen to have pro-Putin, pro-regime accounts, and on the left, anti-Putin, anti-regime accounts. Like I said, the absolute location is not what's as important as the relative location that creates this peanut shape. So we have political accounts in this map, and now they represent 52% of all accounts. It's gone from 5.5% in 2012 to 52% in 2018, a 10-fold increase. We have very clearly defined clusters, both on the anti-Putin and the pro-Putin side. There are still some very large dots, some very influential accounts in the center, but there's not as many of them. And even with communities that are not overtly political, such as this community we found, Russian youth influencers, they do have an undercurrent of political tone. So this is a community we found in 2018 on Twitter that was very youth oriented, a lot of avatars and profile images of young people. It was very much focused on new platforms such as YouTube And it had no overt political message, but if you dug into their posts a little bit, it was very clear that they were Putin supporters and sort of pushing soft propaganda of the form of like, oh, isn't Russia great right now? Like, we don't need to change everything. Everything's great. And this really looks like an effort by Kremlin-aligned or regime-aligned forces to target these new platforms like YouTube to maybe counteract some of the anti-regime sentiment on these platforms. We also did this analysis for Facebook. And again, there's not nearly as defined a structure here, but that could be due to that bias of only being able to see the public pages, which really represent the public face of Russia. So we have a lot of accounts related to Russian media, Russian ministries and departments, international organizations, but we don't really know what's going on the individual local community level beyond these official faces. So that naturally brings us to the map of VKontakte is the next step. So here what we see is something in between what was going on in 2012 and in 2018 on Twitter. There is a little bit of separation on this map. On the left, we see clusters around general interest and the Tatar people. They're not quite as tightly clustered. On the right, we see a lot of political accounts, and they make up about 32% of the map in between what we saw in 2012 on Twitter and in 2018 on Twitter. So still a significant fraction, but not literally the majority of the conversation or the majority of the accounts. And very interestingly, we see not a bipartite structure of clear political polarization between two factions, but a tripartite structure, 3 different communities. So we see anti-regime communities and in 2018 pro-regime communities, and this new cluster of local politics accounts. These are accounts that are still political, but they're very much focused on local issues. What is going on in my town, in my region? What are the local politicians saying and doing for my livelihood? And much less invested in the what's going on in Moscow and St. Petersburg, what is the federal government doing, what is Putin doing or saying, much more focused on the local. We found this so interesting that we decided to do another analysis of these communities, which is called a heterophily analysis. And just to not get into too much of the detail, but give you the key insights from this analysis, what we've done is represented it as a heat map where the darker the squares, the stronger interconnected the communities. And in the top left of the slide in the heat map, you see local politics, that new local politics group, and it is a dark blue square, very strongly interconnected. So even though these communities, members of these local politics communities are coming from all over Russia, from the Far East to the South to the North, they are talking to each other. And we think this is really borne out in what we've seen in the Russian news and political developments in the last few years. There have been lots of local environmental movements around places like Koshta and Shiyes. There have been local political protests in Khabarovsk around the governor there. And there, of course, have been local elections that the anti-Putin opposition was able to capitalize on by leveraging local dissatisfaction with Putin and the United Russia Party and actually kicking them out of power in several jurisdictions around the country, having real electoral success that was based on selected candidates that spoke to, well, our community is falling apart, our town is in shambles, our mayor or governor is corrupt, we need to do something about that, never mind Putin. So this is a very interesting development that we see in 2020. Similarly, or along similar lines, when we look at these more established political communities such as the anti-regime opposition and pro-government forces, we see something different than we saw in 2018. We don't see these super tight clustered coalitions, but rather we see more loose, broader alignments of interested communities. So the way this appears on this graph is the opposition and the pro-government. There are some dark blue squares there, but they're not completely dark blue squares, and that represents a broader and a looser connection between these groups, or rather within these groups, than we see, for instance, in the local politics. When we dug into what these loose coalitions represent, we find that in the opposition side, very interestingly, there is a pro-USSR cluster that is very focused on nostalgia for the USSR and wanting to bring the USSR back in some form, that is now aligned with other, both more mainstream opposition and sort of these more anti-corruption, anti-government forces represented by Alexei Navalny and the Anti-Corruption Foundation. We see this also borne out in the news, especially in very recent reports where there's been rumblings of the Communist Party, which is obviously USSR nostalgic and focused. At the top, officially, the Zyuganov and the top officials disavowing Navalny and the recent protests in 2021, but in the rank and file on the local level, actually very much supporting Navalny. And this new rift that exists between the top elite and the rank and file suggests that there may be some political realignment with some of these USSR nostalgic folks joining in the anti-corruption bandwagon. On the pro-government side, we also see something very, very interesting. We see a new alignment between communities that are very politically oriented, sort of pushing Kremlin messages, pro-government messages, and communities that are much more focused on social issues, such as a Russian Orthodox community focused on LGBT and abortion issues, but not as expressly focused on politics. So again, a new coalition is emerging there on the pro-government side. When we look at the media sharing part of the landscape, we generally see something very similar. We see that the local politics group tends to share links to apolitical domains, but has a small pro-regime bent. We see that the pro-regime and anti-regime groups tend to share a diversity of content based on the specific communities within them, so that USSR nostalgia cluster tends to share politically radical outlets, while other clusters tend to share more mainstream sources. And that's on the anti-regime side. And on the pro-regime side, again, that Russian Orthodox cluster, in line with our previous analysis, tends to share media on social issues such as abortion and LGBT rights, while other clusters tend to share non-state media in line with state narratives. Finally, we did look at that general interest, non-political cluster, and found that they share lifestyle and social media content, including some local content. When we look at media sharing patterns broadly across the entire landscape, we find a continued evidence of this pattern we observed in 2012 and 2018. Russian state-sponsored outlets are generally shared across all communities. The pro-regime forces continue their dominance of the media space and of the narrative. And as I foreshadowed earlier, mainstream pro-Kremlin outlets may act as a cultural bridge between two sides of the Russian, I shouldn't say right wing, but pro-regime political spectrum. The pro-Putin support and the cultural, maybe cultural conservative side, what we would think of cultural conservatives in the US. or those of us who are in the US. So again, this is a very, very important finding because it speaks to the strategic role that the government and official state-aligned propaganda is playing, not only to persecute, perceived or real opponents of the regime, but also to unite supporters of the regime in a pretty advanced and kind of subtle way, creating not just a political agenda, but an agenda that can appeal to less politically motivated, but social issues motivated people and voters. A sort of cross beyond political narrative that creates a unified vision of Russia united behind Putin and espousing these traditional values, and at the same time pushing this particular political agenda domestically and abroad. Finally, we saw a slight but interesting overlap between the Russian religion Orthodox cluster and the pro-Russian Ukrainian expansion clusters on religious domains, which speaks to some more of this cultural bridge work that religion might be playing in today's landscape in Russia and VKontakte. Last but not least, we wanted to look at the sorts of narratives that these communities engaged in. So we looked at 3 different kinds of political communities we have identified so far: that new local politics community, the anti-regime community, and the pro-regime community. And for each one of them, we looked at the top words and phrases that these communities were sharing. And what we found that was on the local politics side, we found a lot of focus on local elections terms. Things like принял участие, participated in some forum or some electoral drive, Совета депутатов, Council of the Members of Parliament. On the anti-regime side, we found a lot of focus on personalities such as Alexei Navalny, the former President Dmitry Medvedev, and satirist Viktor Shenderovich, and other media personalities. And on the pro-regime side, we found still a focus on the Ukraine conflict, talking about things like Minsk соглашения, Minsk agreements to de-escalate the conflict, Russia-Ukraine, and head of the DNR Republic in the east of Ukraine. This finding shows that even though the Kremlin is clearly exercising a lot of power and influence to create a unified narrative and bring disparate communities together, there is no landscape-wide narrative that is really engaging all 3 political factions or all 3 dimensions of the political part of this landscape, much less the non-political accounts or the less politically interested accounts. And I think this is a very important finding because it speaks to an opportunity that arises to create such a narrative within Russia, of course, for a new emergent community or locus of power to arise that can unite Russians behind it and create sort of a new way forward out of this current situation where there's a lot of crosstalk and not a lot of mutual agreement between the different parts of Russian society and the political spectrum. So with that, I've come to the end of the slides. I want to thank you very much for listening. And of course, I will be very happy to answer your questions at this time. And thanks so much again to Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Vlad. That was excellent presentation. So I have received several questions to me and also in the chat, but let me just see if there's anybody who'd like to ask a question directly. Then turn off your mic or turn on your mic, unmute yourself, and ask a question. Let me open the floor for that.
I'm sorry. Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
I already wrote a question, but it was in Russian because I cannot right now to switch to English. But it's about the Tatars community. Okay. So I apologize that I wrote it in Russian.
That's okay. I'm happy to answer the question.
But you can answer Russian or English, doesn't matter.
I'll answer in English. I
Yeah.
assume most
Mhm.
people here speak English. Yes, the Tatar community is very interesting. We did dig into it a little bit for the report, and we found that it is a cultural and religious aligned community, but one that is also very personality aligned. I think around the leader of Tatarstan, who is big personality and a lot of accounts following that leader's page and you know, expressing adulation and support for him, but also talking about local Tatar specific cultural, religious, daily life issues.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. This is Daniel Galperouche from Voice of America Russian Service. Hello. Mike, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I can.
My question is, could you please elaborate a little bit on the role of social media and specifically VKontakte in recent Russian protests, how they played? And the second question, maybe, if you could give your estimate of how much Kremlin does his job in social media, because sometimes people confuse, is this, you know, thousands and thousands of pro-Putin people are trolls, bots, and I don't know, if you can talk also about possible expenses on that, would be also good. Thank you very much.
Of course, happy to answer, Daniela. So to your first question, the role of social media in the very recent 2021 protests is clearly non-trivial. There's, as always, yet a new social media frontier. One thing we saw reports of and did some digging into, though we weren't able to publish it under this project or include it under this report rather, is the role of TikTok, which is a very new platform and one that is being adopted very widely, at least for the purpose of the late January protests around the imprisonment and the trial over Alexei Navalny. There did seem to be quite a lot of sharing of protest-related activity, and very tellingly, some of it was very sort of action-oriented. I don't have the reference on me right now, but it was accounts not just sharing like rah rah Navalny, boo Putin. It was like, all right, this is what to do if you get tear gassed. Like, this is how to like resist the police, or resist being beaten up rather. This is, you know, who you should, I think those were like, the tear gas was the one that I actually remembered most clearly. So that's the one I'll stick to. And so, but anyway, the focus is clearly on like very specific actions and tactics for being a protester, which I would say is pretty significant, right? This is not just, there's this big issue with social media where, you know, how much social media, does social media activity translate to quote unquote offline activity where people go out on the streets? And I would say a bridge between that is when you see social media activity that is very, very specific to, you know, this is what you should do in this particular offline situation. That is actually pointing to, okay, this is not just people being angry on Twitter or on TikTok. This is people planning to participate in a protest. So I do know that there were some efforts by the government to censor or shut down access to some of the sharing. It is not clear to me how successful or how extensive those efforts were. So I can't speak to that with full confidence, but there is a broad pattern by the Russian government to try and censor and control the internet. And I would say generally that has not been super successful so far. Most tellingly with Telegram, which the government basically tried to shut down completely and failed to do so. To your second question, the role of Kremlin in sort of controlling the social media space, I would say it's sort of a kitchen sink type approach. The Kremlin tries a lot of different things. It has sort of official state outlets and state propaganda that are more on the mass media side, but have social media outlets. It does, there are certainly factories, troll factories as they have been described, that are pushing Kremlin-aligned messages and seem to be connected to Russian the Russian intelligence apparatus. It tries a lot of different tactics at the same time, and some of them will stick just by the sheer number of it. But I will say it's a lot of, trying to push unrest down and control message from the top, and not a lot of real grassroots activity. I think one thing that the regime especially maybe enjoyed 10 years ago was a real grassroots support for Putin. People saying like, oh yeah, like legitimately, I think he's great for Russia, in Russia. And I think that has waned for various reasons, from things like people no longer being as comfortable financially, to these protests, to actions by the government, such as Navalny's poisoning, or allegedly Navalny's poisoning, I should say, and poisoning of the Skripal family in England. These have definitely degraded grassroots support for the regime. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And then Michael, I think you have a question. Your hands up.
Yeah, thank you. So I already posted this in the chat, same question. So Vlad, I'm wondering if you've been also tracking internet forums like 4chan or Reddit, especially the Russian language. Do you see any similarity or identical posts from those forums in VK? And I'm wondering, I mean, the internet forums, that they have anonymity, so do people feel bolder, whether anti-regime or pro-regime? Over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. As all of these are excellent questions. So there are a lot of different platforms that we have looked at. In fact, for simplicity, I said like our first analysis was on Twitter, but actually, if you go even further back, I think our very first analysis of Russia was Russian blog networks, which is getting to your point a little bit. I think those platforms were very, very popular and really dominated the discussion like around 10 years ago, and they have been less popular since then. Internet forums are still obviously very much part of the landscape. There's only so much data we can collect and track, so we're not really able to do detailed mappings of all of them just due to the sheer amount of time. But I think generally looking at those types of spaces, I would say that they tend to be a little bit more politically, not extreme, but like a little bit more politically open and vociferous. People really like saying their opinions very, very actively, versus what we saw in VKontakte was not necessarily more mild, but a more diverse picture, with some people still talking very actively about politics and other people talking about daily life and other people only talking about local politics and not really talking about Putin. So I would say, yeah, the forum space is a more polarized space and a more politically, a more politically, I don't want to say active, but more stronger political language. Yeah, I would say stronger political language is used in that space.
And Vlad, when you say that, you mean on both sides, both pro and anti-regime?
I've especially seen that on the anti-regime side, but yes, I would imagine there's some of that on the pro-regime side as well.
Excuse me, Robert, may I ask a question to Vlad, please? This is Vladimir Sotnikov here. May
Yes,
I?
please go ahead, Vladimir.
Yeah, Vlad, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I just want to ask you one question. How did you gather all these statistics regarding a percentage of who are pro-Putin and who are anti-Putin? On what basis? I mean, do you have access to some polls? Because in Russia, actually, these statistics are very much scarce. You cannot find real figures, and the figures also sometimes are distorted. Who are supporting anti-Putin demonstrations, like it was in case of Navalny, or who are not supporting, and including the number of the detained persons after the latest protests. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Yeah, so we use public data. This analysis is based on sort of this notion of cybersocial landscapes. Not sort of, it is based on this notion of cybersocial landscapes that I described, and the data source for it is social media data. So what we have found in our analyses is that these data sources are good at capturing broad trends in the populace rather than very, very specific figures. So for example, when we do all of our mappings, we actually work with subject matter experts, when possible with Russian sociologists, obviously on this kind of work, or with local analysts who are knowledgeable in Russia and speak Russian. We work with them on validating our quantitative results. So first, there's two steps in this process. First, we collect publicly available data. We run it through an algorithm that says, I think there's 12 communities in this landscape, and I think these 3 are pro-Putin, different flavors of pro-Putin, and this one is the Tatar community, and these 2 are the local politics communities, and these 2 are the anti-Putin communities, things like that. And then we go and give the data to one of these subject matter experts, or even a team of them, and say, can you double check this for us? Are these people actually expressing what you believe to be genuine pro or anti-Putin sentiment? Are they actually trolls or bots? Are they real accounts and things like that? And so that's why I feel confident in the findings that I'm presenting to you today. Now, to the point about broad strokes versus specific numbers, what these findings tend to capture is the overall structure and division of interest and attention in this space. So for instance, the fact that we went from 5% political communities in 2012 to 50% in 2018, that's significant. Maybe it's not actually 50, maybe it's 43, and maybe it used to be 7, not 5, but it's on that rough order of magnitude. And then similarly, the fact that we have right now observed a tripartite structure with pro-Putin, anti-Putin, and local politics communities, that's significant in and of itself. Whether it's really 30%, 30%, 30%, or maybe it's 45% pro-Putin, 25% anti-Putin, 30% local politics, that's where you want to cross-reference with polling data. And I very much take your point. You need accurate and good polling data to be confident in it. But these analyses can point the way to the kinds of dimensions of the landscape you should be paying attention to.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions coming in from the chat. There's one from Jackie. which is asking, have you done any work looking at the transnational connections prevalent for the main clusters, either in VK, Twitter, or Facebook? So looking at connections between the Russian groups and groups abroad.
Of course. Yes. So we actually have. So the most obvious transnational connection is the Ukrainian one. So in, I think, pretty much every single mapping we've done, even in the VK one, though it's not as prominent, we have seen some folks who are Ukrainian or interested in Ukraine, or in the part of Ukraine that's currently contested, but is within the geopolitical boundaries of Ukraine. So there's lots of overlap. Unsurprisingly, there's lots of linguistic overlap. Lots of Ukrainians speak Russian. There's lots of cultural overlap. So they do show up in each other's spaces. That's the main one. We also saw a broader connection to Europe and the US, specifically in the Facebook map. That was the sort of big distinguishing characteristic of the Facebook mapping. Again, we're really only able to look at public pages, which represent these bigger organizations, which by their nature are probably a little bit more likely, actually I would say much more likely to be transnational than, a local community on Rostov-on-Don or some other relatively small Russian city. Or even just a Russian city that does not have a lot of connections abroad. So on Facebook, yeah, we saw in the international organizations community connections to Europe, especially. There's some, nonprofit, philanthropic sort of support organizations that were connected to Europe. But again, very much on the official plane, not on the individual people talking to each other plane.
Yeah, there were some other questions in the chat too, or maybe just to me directly. One was looking at the fact that there were sites for 96 groups organizing protests in 2011, 2012. And wondering if websites is a place where people might be organizing in 2020, if you have any data on that kind of thing.
That's a great question. So the major category of websites we looked at was media websites. We were specifically interested in media sharing. And obviously, media websites will tend to spread information, including information about protests, but they're not really as focused on organization. I will say that some of the opposition, anti-regime media we looked at were being censored or banned in Russia, which obviously limits their power to speak to the Russian people. I would say that websites are really good at disseminating information, but social media peer-to-peer is where a lot of organization is happening. And we see this not just in Russia, but really all over the world. It's people sharing things on WhatsApp, on Telegram, chatting with each other, forming small groups, rather than taking the effort of building a website that says, go to the protest in Moscow on the 23rd, go to this area and then this area. That was all handled live through social media posts.
Okay, then we have another question in the chat from Tanya. How does your data set designate user nationality, Russian or Ukrainian? Is this by self-reported location in the user profile or another data point? As you suggest, there is a lot of cross-pollination between various communities here.
Absolutely. So what we look at is, again, that two-step process. We have an algorithm that looks at what a person's, or rather an account's interest vector, what they pay attention to or who they pay attention to on Twitter or in VKontakte, and tries to determine a nationality automatically that way as part of an interest group. Again, like for us, the more important thing is like, who are you paying attention to? Who are you connected to? And sort of, if that happens to be a cluster of like Ukrainian media personalities, then you're more likely to be Ukrainian. But that's the demographic nationality identification is not the primary point of analysis. We do, again, have that second step of a human verifying that process and saying, okay, actually, this cluster, this community that the algorithm said, you know, is Ukrainian media personalities. Actually, a lot of them are posting from all over the place. I don't think we should qualify them as Ukrainian. We should say like broadly Russian media personalities. I'm just using a toy example here. So those are really the two steps that we use to define what a community is composed of, or who a community is composed of.
Mhm. And then there's one more question here in the chat. Is there a correlation between the posts referring to local politics and the timing of Putin's annual phone-in event? Or, yeah, so that's interesting connection between the local and the federal, but you know, what is driving the local might be a, you know, second broader question.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that, and I didn't speak about this in my presentation as much because I wanted to focus on this novel thing, which is that the local politics activity that we observed is very much local grassroots from the ground up. Yes, absolutely. There is a strong effort by the federal government in Russia to control local affairs, to, you know, appoint officials, to drive initiatives in particular ways. But the specific activity we were looking at VKontakte weren't so much like, oh, Putin phoned in and spoke with the governor and like, you know, made sure things were going well in our region. It was like, oh, this company tied to the local governor is trying to build a mall in the center of our town, and we actually want to have a park there. We're gonna protest against that. Call your local officials and say to them that you don't want to see a mall. And this is, I would say, from you know, civic society perspective, this is a very encouraging sign, no matter what your political allegiance lies, where your political allegiance lies, because it's really an indication that people are taking charge of local matters and feeling empowered as citizens to have a voice, rather than thinking about directives from Putin or from the federal government.
Okay, then yeah, one last question which came in, which was, has this report been published yet? And you know, where might we find that or find others of your work? So if you want to give a little plug for your publications, yes.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just see if I can post a link very quickly. So while I'm posting the link, the Twitter and Facebook research is a little bit older, so it has been put online as a preprint on SSRN. This is not an official publication, but it is a place where you can read the reports. I highly recommend everyone check it out. And we hope to put the VKontakte report in the same SSRN network as well, as soon as we're ready to publish it, which is going to be hopefully in the next couple of months.
All right, Vlad. Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I really appreciated your insights and obviously those wonderful graphics. I like the spinning dots. That's a big advance on the kind of network analysis that we've seen. And so definitely hope to follow up with you and learning more about these networks and how they're operating, what that means for Russian politics going forward. But thank you very much for your presentation today and look forward to doing more of this kind of thing in the future. So, and thank you to all the members of the audience, including from Santiago, Chile. Somebody wrote, It's great to have international audience, both in South America, North America, and Europe, and elsewhere. Thank you very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you at our next presentations at IRES. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Mhm.
Bye.